May I speak in the name of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. It's an enormous privilege for me to be with you here this morning, and I want to thank your Dean for his very generous invitation. Our two cathedrals feel to me like siblings within the household of faith, which is the Anglican family. And although our settings are very different, Salisbury Cathedral resides not in a vibrant capital city, but in a small market town in rural England. Our purposes are identical. We exist to be visible expressions of Christianity in the public square, to renew the hope of our communities and our nations, and no less so is that true in the days when our social and political worlds feel much more like contested space. Some of you will probably know Salisbury Cathedral from the paintings by John Constable, at least one of which is in your own National Gallery of Art. In 1831, John Constable was deeply anxious about the political events which were unfolding in England. It was the time of electoral reform, and there were also changes happening to the religious landscape. And Constable held quite conformist views at a time when many of his friends were radicals and dissenters. He feared the divisions of his day. So he painted Salisbury Cathedral as a firm rock within that turbulence. And he painted a rainbow across the skyline of the cathedral. I'm afraid the Washington version doesn't have the rainbow. But you have to imagine the rainbow because it's there to remind us of God's secure promise in the light of the threats, as he saw it, to the stability of his society. Well, as the spotlight of international interest has been playing upon the politics and leadership of your nation these last months, we have been praying for your cathedral here, for its ministry and witness. Of course, it has to be said that in Salisbury we're dealing with our own form of divisions. The referendum on whether to leave the European Union last summer is still being interpreted and reinterpreted, and Brexit appears on just about every news bulletin that there is. Just this week, the process of leaving the European Union was debated in our own parliament, with more parliamentarians turning up for that debate than at any time since the debates of 1831. So in the United Kingdom, we have our own journey into an unknown future. And the Lenten responsibility of both of our cathedrals is to proclaim that in all our weaknesses and our uncertainties, that we might also know God's power to save. And it's with the known and the unknown that I want to reflect with you this morning. Our readings given to us for this second Sunday of Lent describe two men who had their reliance on what they knew challenged. We heard in our first two readings about Abraham, who was uprooted from his homeland and familiar community, from its security and values and the culture that he knew. God offered Abraham a different way of being and living, one that would bring about, he promised, a hopeful future. But to step into it, Abraham had to leave behind what he knew and discover a new identity, a different identity, and fresh possibilities. And then from John's Gospel that we've just heard, our greater focus is going to be on that personality of Nicodemus, who receives a similar invitation when he comes to Jesus by night. That's exactly how people long remembered Nicodemus, as the man of the night. When later we hear that he joins forces with Joseph of Arimathea to bury the body of Jesus after the crucifixion, you may remember that we hear that same memory of Nicodemus being replayed. Nicodemus, who had first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. So in understanding this not very easy conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus, we are told right from the start to notice that they talked in the shades of the night. Who is this man who preferred a nocturnal visit? Well, he's wealthy and influential. Buying 100 pounds of costly spices for the burial rites of Jesus caused him not a second thought. And whether it was that he'd inherited wealth or that he'd acquired riches, we will never know. But he possessed substantial resources. He was also a leader of the Jews. What this means is that he was a member of the 70-man Sanhedrin, a body that was both a legislature and a judiciary. Can you imagine what it would like to be always replacing 70 members of your Supreme Court? Well, Nicodemus was one such as that. It was his job to know how to maintain security for the nation in the face of people who thought they knew better. And he was an upright man. Being a Pharisee meant that he'd pledged to keep the precise prescriptions of the law. Here is a man right at the heart of institutional power, helping to run the machinery which brought about civil stability, yes, but also it was his job to know what was acceptable and what was unacceptable. And because of all of this, Nicodemus knows what he knows. He's a man of conviction and certitude. And he speaks to Jesus out of that authority, asserting what he believes to be true. Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God. For no one can do these signs that you do except for the presence of God. So he starts his relationship with Jesus by asserting what he knows to be true. He speaks courteously, but his manners are built on an air of superiority. You can sense it. He knows his ground, and knowledge has brought with it self-satisfaction, a tone of confidence. Do you know, I assume that there are many people like Nicodemus in this great city. People who have been taught by our culture and their upbringing to value security and certainty. People taught to be independent, competent, to plan their way through life. Many of them decent people with clear moral, even perhaps religious certitudes. They take control of things. And when it comes to what they think works for themselves and the communities around them, there's maybe even a degree of intransigence about them. They're sure of themselves and pretty sure of their view of the world. So why do you think such a man would venture out at night to converse with someone who sits right outside those matrices of power and knowledge? Someone who isn't going to be impressed by Nicodemus's certitude. I suppose the most obvious possibility is that Nicodemus simply didn't want anyone else to know what he was doing. He might have been afraid of what others would make of an association with Jesus. This weekend, I'm actually on my way towards California because our cathedral choirs, both boys and girls, are going to be on a tour around the vicinity of San Francisco and Stanford University. It's wonderful to see your girls' choir singing this morning. Salisbury Cathedral was the very first English cathedral to allow girls to sing the choral tradition. 25 years ago, we introduced them, and we've never before brought both the boys and the girls' choir to the USA. And bringing them together in that ancient tradition of choral music, sacred music, into the industries of Silicon Valley is going to be an interesting venture. It reminds me of a conversation that I had with a CEO of a tech company in California a couple of years ago. He was an Episcopalian who worshipped at his local church most Sundays. But he confessed to me that he would never let anybody at work know that he was a committed churchgoer. He knew that if he did so, their view of him would change, and he clearly felt that that wouldn't be for the better. Maybe Nicodemus was like that. He feared for his reputation and standing. Yet, do you know, I don't think fear was his only motivation. Maybe it was that Nicodemus desired a different kind of privacy as well. Away from the daylight, Nicodemus was also away from the crowds and buzz of society. He could stand aside from that all-knowing public face of his and admit that he was a puzzled man. You can hear it in his questioning, and that what attracted him to Jesus wasn't merely curiosity, but was a thirst for a sense of God. He was invited by Jesus to explore his own sense of imprisonment, trapped by the very culture and values of a society in which he was a leader. Things of which he was certain were the very things which prevented him from growing towards a greater freedom. And if he was going to admit all this to himself, then he didn't want to do it in public. He wanted the privacy of a place where he could acknowledge the limitations of what he knew and how sometimes they let him down. Yes, we need the security of what we know. We need to live within its familiar and tested and safe horizons. Yet if we are to be fully alive, we also have to take risks. Too much security stifles us. Too much reliance on what we think we know leads us down misleading tracks. Even those of us most confident in what we know find that occasionally we need God to intervene. Which I think is why John emphasizes that this encounter happens in the night. It's the place not just of privacy, but of spiritual and human struggle. Do you remember how when Judas goes out finally to betray Jesus, John also tells us there, and it was night. Well, on this night, Jesus is leading Nicodemus to see that there is another way of being and living. He proposes a way that he calls being born from above. Their conversation is really about the quality of Nicodemus's life and how a good life needs faith to journey into the unknown. So what is it that Nicodemus is offered? What does faith in Jesus Christ add to the quest of a good life for us? Jesus offers us two powerful options. which he calls being born of water and the Spirit. The water is about having a deeper identity. However we define ourselves, be it through our wealth, our social status, or maybe even our victimhood, there is a more powerful identity available to us as a child of God. And we see it symbolized in the waters of baptism. We're defined not by what we possess or our affiliations, how people see us, or even by what has happened to us in the past, but by something so much more fundamental, that God calls us by our name and he makes us his own beloved child. And then born of the Spirit is about the promise of new possibilities. Which of us doesn't long for the promise of a hopeful future? We are reborn as we trust in the only thing that we can truly and absolutely know as secure, that we are guided not by our own self-reliance, but by God's Spirit of love. I think one of the things that our two cathedrals have got in common is that they operate in societies where people are pretty sure of what they know. Often, they even belligerently assert it. Prosperity, position in society, or peer pressure means sometimes that it's only away from the crowds, in the shadows of our own night, that we give ourselves permission to admit that we need more, that we need to be born from above. Well, the season of Lent is about learning how to let go of the things that we rely on, but which imprison us, which seduce us but do us no good. Lent is about listening in case there is a better way, a way of water, a deeper identity for us, and the Spirit, of new possibilities, different possibilities offered to us in Jesus Christ. May you enjoy a rich and holy Lent. And I promise that if you ever visit us in Salisbury, I will try and make sure that there's a rainbow over the cathedral. Amen.